We've got a lot to cover in a relatively short period of time, and I want to start it off with you, Tony, if we could. Could I ask you to define stakeholder in the context of the book and the broader work?
Well, a stakeholder is someone who holds a stake. And therefore, it is not the organization that defines its stakeholders. It's the stakeholder that defines the organization where he or she believes it has a stake in. And that is very important because it also, basically the stakeholder is someone who affects the organization in its activities and is affected by the organization in its activities. And in many cases it's both ways, in other cases it's one way or the other way. What is important in this is that we always speak about engagement, stakeholder engagement, and I think this is important that the organization makes a difference between involvement and engagement. And engagement implies a ring. I mean, if you're going to get married, you get engaged to get married. So I don't think that the organization wants to engage with all its stakeholders because practically everyone that deals with an organization is a stakeholder. And therefore, if the organization deals with all the people it needs to deal with, that's all it has. It won't be able to manufacture anything anymore because all the human effort, the resource effort that goes into engaging with stakeholders would be completely crazy. So it is important that the organization distinguishes between involving its stakeholders and therefore making available to them and facilitating their access to all the reporting and performance and activities that the organization does in all its horizontal functions, and then selects issue by issue, objective by objective, those stakeholder groups that are really important for the pursuit of the objective that the organization is trying to. And unfortunately, this is not commonly known, neither amongst my professional colleagues. Everybody, I mean, it's like a buzzword. Everybody's a stakeholder, so you have to engage with everybody. I engage with someone I want to eventually marry. That's what. And then, of course, sometimes there's divorce, then there's marriage, then there are a lot of various phases. But involvement is the first phase. I am involved with someone. I'm not engaged with someone.
I think a key point you raised there is that the organization, the company, doesn't get to select its stakeholders necessarily. Stakeholders
when it moves to an engagement process, yes, it does select its stakeholders. Some stakeholders are mandatory. I mean, the public policy decision-making people, the employees, or at least the employee representatives, according to the system of each country, the consumers or customers, according to the size of the operation, and some of these need to be engaged, and therefore the organization needs to engage them. And engaging means involving them in the decision-making process, basically. Mm-hmm. And you can't involve the world in a decision-making process because then no decision will ever be made. But you can involve the ones who will affect your decisions or who will be affected by your decisions.
So, Tony, you've talked about kind of the overall environment. Emilio, I thought we could then go into the firm level and look through your eyes. What implications does this have for an organization like Allianz? How have you led this change, this change in approach, not engagement, but involvement then? What would you share from your perspective?
I think what comes first is to make sure that the employees, as the first, most important stakeholder for the expression of the corporation, are involved, informed and involved about the company strategy, and ideally contribute to the company strategy. Increasingly now, we're out of the world of black and white. So every employee, whether in a back office function or in a front office function, is tackled with dilemmas. in an interaction with a customer, do I have to care only for the shareholder, so the profit, or shouldn't I do the interest of the customer himself? And what about my own interest as an employee in between? So we can't give them solutions from A to Z in huge files and huge cupboards. We need to enable our employees to be able to tackle them. So it starts with them sharing, understanding, and contributing to the strategy. So the first effort is about internal communication. But then comes the more difficult part, because not necessarily, if you are involved and understand the strategy, are you equipped to deal with dilemmas? And that's about leadership. So we truly feel that communication has to get out of the corner of the silo of the ivory tower of being a separate function that gets its pride out of budgets, FTEs, or reporting to the CEO, into diminishing its own organizational role in terms of the power play of the typical alpha male attitude, into how it can really serve the organization by empowering and enabling leaders and employees in order to tackle these dilemmas that we can't foresee, because they're a constant challenge in different cultures, in different situations, and we need to rely upon the brain and the heart of the single employee.
And I know that we had a discussion before that this runs from the very top all the way down to the frontline employee, there's no last employee, of course, but every employee. Talk a little bit about that, the various roles.
I think we are really advantaged by coming out of a core culture of our roots. I am an Italian, but I work for a German-based global company, and the corporate governance in Germany is different from most other countries. We have a two-tier board system, and the supervisory board, which is a board that appoints the management board, is made 50% of shareholder representatives and 50% of labor representatives. So you already have in the corporate governance the strong presence of at least two of the four major stakeholders, the other two being the customers or the clients and society at large, with regulators, politicians, and what Tony addressed. So we feel we are advantaged by a starting position whereby the CEO's appointment won't work just according to his being pleasant to the shareholders. He will be appointed, or she will be appointed, only if at least two stakeholders buy into a strategy. So it starts from the top, but it gets down to the very last, if there is a last employee. The example I choose is a lady in Singapore that I love very much, Sadia Zain. She's our receptionist in Singapore, and she expressed this philosophy in a very simple way that I really love. She went to her boss and said, "Look, I'm the receptionist. I'm the first face people are seeing when entering the building. So I would like to have this job title recognized." And what she got was her job title. She sent me a picture of herself, a nice smiling Asian face, with a plaque in front of her saying, "Sadia Zain, Director of First Impressions." I think that says it all.
That's so wonderful story. I want to come back a little bit to this discussion of some of the different cultural implications of stakeholder relationships. But Jim, I'd like to bring you into the discussion, please. Talk about this 21st century developing strategic management approach that both Tony and Emilio have alluded to, that your work has really expanded upon.
Well, I often talk about what might it be indeed two cultures of the public relations profession. And cultures are kind of all-encompassing belief systems that people have about what they're doing and why they're doing and what effect it has and so on. And Tony's work, his stakeholder management work here, is based heavily on what I call the public relations and strategic management role. Now, that if you look at what typical public relations firms do, or the typical public relations activity, it fits into what I call a symbolic interpretive approach. That is, they're all about messages and using symbols to convey messages to somebody. It's not always clear to whom they're addressing it, except perhaps to the media, and they think everyone pays attention to the media. Now, Of course, that's being called into question with digital media because now the users of the media control the content essentially rather than the purveyors of the media and so on. The strategic, while the idea here is essentially what I called a buffering activity. It's taken from a Dutch public relations educator, Kees van Riel, who talks about buffering, meaning somehow if I can just put out positive message that'll create some sort of what I would call cognitive representation in people's minds, whether it be an image or a reputation or an impression or a brand or any of those things, which in my mind essentially mean the same thing. That somehow this cognitive representation, what people are thinking, is going to govern their behavior or control their behavior. So somehow if you can get people to think well of you by putting out positive messages, then they're going to behave in ways that support your organization. I regularly get an email from someone who calls himself the reputation doctor, for example. And I'm not sure what that means, except perhaps if something bad happens, they'll put out positive information that'll try to fix that. The strategic management approach essentially holds that public relations is the voice of publics or stakeholders, and I use the term somewhat interchangeably. I think stakeholder categories are made up of different kinds of publics that vary in the extent to which they communicate actively or passively or not at all with your organization. So essentially the strategic management role of public relations is to identify who those strategic publics are. That is, those publics that are affected by the consequences of organizational decisions, or they behave in ways that have consequences on whether what the organization can do, or oppose it, or support it, or one or the other. So public relations then has a specialized role of identifying publics, communicating with them, that is, using communication tools to develop relationships with those publics. And among these communication tools are listening in particular, and listening, as Tony points out very well in the book, takes place in many different ways, primarily through different forms of research that a public relations function can do. So in the strategic management role, you see much more of an interactive role where public relations is interacting with those strategic publics of the organization to build relationships with them, and not just disseminating messages willy-nilly trying to create a favorable image. Mm-hmm. So in my chapter of the book, I delve into great depth into what is an image, what is a reputation, what is an impression, and how that's affected by communication, and how that relates to the behavior of both the organization and the public. And particularly, images or a reputation is essentially what members of the public think and say about an organization. And what we found is what they most talk about is the behavior of the organization. So therefore, if you really want to improve an organization's reputation, you have to improve its behavior, and the public relations role is to improve that behavior.
Great. Well, Tony, I want to come back to you and kind of put a wrapper on this now. We're talking about a significantly different way of thinking about stakeholders, yes, of interacting with them. Share your thoughts on the role of the board in that process, and in that interaction, or that.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the biggest dilemma today for anyone who has managerial responsibilities of any type of organization, whether it's a state or an NGO or a company, listed or non-listed company, is to improve the quality of its decisions. And the improvement of the quality of the decision-making process of the organization can happen only if the organizations, before taking its decisions, listens to the expectations of the stakeholders as I defined them before. And this doesn't mean that it's a red carpet treatment of stakeholder expectations. To the contrary, what it does mean is that you're not always, as we are today, in a totally continuous crisis response mode, because we don't know what our stakeholders are going to do when we proceed with our decision, implementing our decisions, and then we're always surprised by their reaction. So if you listen to them before, if you adapt your decisions, if this is not strategically improper, to their expectations, or if you prepare for the crisis when their expectations do come in, are becoming evident as you proceed in your implementation process, then you accelerate the time of implementation of your decision. And that is today the most valuable thing that any organization can do. Now, in this context, the process of governance of an organization, and therefore the role of the board, is under question, has been so for some years now. Emilio already mentioned the dual system in Germany, and not only in Germany, but also in other Northern European countries. I believe that the most probably interesting new thing that has happened over the last 10, 15 years is from South Africa, comes from South Africa, where Mervyn King, who is now the chairman of the International Integrated Reporting Council, he is a South African Supreme Court judge. He, with the Institute of Directors of South Africa, published in 2008, so it's not yesterday, it's maybe the day before yesterday, something called the King Report 3, and where the Chapter 8 explicitly says that the board of directors is empowered in deciding stakeholder relationship policies, issue by issue, and then giving management the responsibility of implementing them. This means moving to the board level all the listening process of the organization, because it is only that way that the organization can decide in the cases of conflict of interest between stakeholder groups, or between some stakeholder groups and the organization, or between the organization and the public interest, which is different from the stakeholder interests, of course, which way to go. And management needs to follow up. This is a very intelligent and very interesting sustainability issue which comes out now for the governance of the board. And it's expanding in a number of countries. I just read yesterday, this is only that in Italy, Telecom Italia, the big telecom company, has just moved to a stakeholder approach of its board. This is the first time that an Italian company does it. There are many other examples around the world, and the International Integrated Reporting Council is moving in this direction. There are already 180 companies from all over the world, usually large listed companies, that are participating in a pilot project, which is a fairly big pilot project with 180 companies. 5 or 6 are coming from this country, from the United States, that are experimenting this process. And I think that's a very interesting development, because it doesn't privilege shareholders, but it does obviously have shareholders as one of its major stakeholder groups. But as Emilio said, then there is the state, the public, the government, the public policy process. Then there are the consumers, which now have been empowered much more than they ever were in the past through digital media and 24/7, 365 communication processes, etc., etc., etc. So it is a much more complex company that boards have to deal with today. And the boards are discussing and comparing, benchmarking different systems, and I think that the shareholder system, which is still prevalent, I believe, in the United States, is declining, and the stakeholder model is rising.
So, Emilio, do you want to chime in on that there?
Absolutely. I think I would like to close on to follow up on what Jim just said about the change from the image and reputation kind of public relation approach to the behavioral approach. And this chimes into what Tony just recently just said right now. We saw this and followed that in the development of the so-called CSR. I must honestly say, I'm sorry for being so blunt, I always had some doubts about corporate social responsibility as an issue. It always reminded me of the left hand of a company hitting the secretary and the right hand sponsoring a fund for abused employees. And having some CEO going to a TV show, giving out checks to an NGO, by the way, not with his own money, but the money of his customers and his shareholders. Warren Buffett or Bill Gates are totally different. They're doing that with their own money. But a publicly listed company doing CSR has always cast some doubt. So a couple of years ago, we addressed that issue, and we did exactly what the King report suggested, and what Tony said. It was just move it out of the communication era, of the reputation era. So we established an ESG board, Environmental Societal Governance Board, which is constituted by 3 executive board members, and not bozos like myself, but real people with a responsibility in the organization. And let me give you 2 examples of how we dealt with it, because it ties into the so-called red carpet that we should or should not give. One is an allegation by an NGO saying that we as a company, by investing in commodity funds, would foster starvation around the world. So the accusation was basically, if I can translate it into more understandable terms, is now you have to prove that you have hit your wife. Now, normal legal systems tell you, I have evidence that you hit your wife, and now you have to defend, but how can I prove that in 53 years of my life I haven't done it? I have to prove 53 years of my life. So we looked at it, we did research, we exchanged, we had long dialogues with this NGO and with scientists, and we could find no evidence that our behavior would influence the prices of food. Another example, Greenpeace told us your investments in Chinese coal companies is fostering CO2 impact, and we all know about the pollution in Beijing. So we entertained a dialogue with Greenpeace, and we found out that of the 4 or 5 Chinese energy utility companies we were invested, 2 or 3 would not engage in any kind of relationship with us on changing their behavior. So we decided, together with Greenpeace, to retreat and get out as shareholders from this company. On the other hand, also again with Greenpeace, we decided that we would stay as shareholders of 2 other coal companies, because as a shareholder, our ability to interact and entertain a dialogue with them, and if you want so, put pressure on them to change their behavior, was a much more successful outcome of that. So in the first case, we tried, but we saw the allegations were simply wrong, so no red carpet. We stick to our position and keep our backbone. I'm sorry, we're not just giving in because it might look nice. And in the second one, there was a reason to do so, and we acted accordingly.
But you listened in both cases, though. That's you didn't shut the door. I want to open up the discussion for a little bit of interaction between the 3 of you as we bring this discussion to a close. We've touched a little bit on we focus a lot on, frankly, non-U.S. examples of what this looks like. And Jim, you might have the distinct pleasure of representing all American organizations on this panel, so no pressure. But when we think about a little bit of the U.S. governance and sort of business environment and context, I mean, does this play differently? Is it fundamentally the same thing? I think a lot of times in the discussion of stakeholder, people see Europe as in a different place than the U.S. sort of fundamentally. You have a thought on that, Jim?
Well, I'm not sure I'm in a position to say too much about the governance in U.S. corporations. I think perhaps Tony may know better than I do. I have, in reading literature on corporate governance over the years, I know that, at least what I've read in Europe, it's probably a more stakeholder-friendly environment than in the United States. And Tony distinguished between the investor model of management and the stakeholder management, and there's a very strong discussion of that in American business schools about the stakeholder approach to management and so on. And one of my best friends in the business school, Lee Preston, for example, was at the University of Maryland Business School, was very much involved in that. So at least if I look at the European literature, there is a good deal of discussion about how to involve stakeholders other than investors in governance. I'm not sure that's not also happening in the United States, but I'm not working at the level where I have that that kind of expertise. But I would like to just follow up on one thing that Emilio said about CSR, however, and that the way he described CSR is very much a symbolic interpretive approach, that if you do something bad, you give money to charity or clean up the trash on a street or something like that. And regularly in the last several years, I've been judging a public relations contest in Romania on corporate social responsibility. And I say over and over and over again, philanthropy is not corporate social responsibility. In fact, what he is describing as dealing with problems of pollution in China or nutrition and so on, this is what I see corporate social responsibility is all about. So what you are doing is counseling behavior of management and decisions made by the board eventually about what is responsible to do and not to do, and that essentially makes both the corporation and society more sustainable. So I think it just depends on how you interpret what we mean. I think CSR is one of those things that have been so misinterpreted by so many public relations people. Just as reputation, I think, is misinterpreted by public relations people as some sort of image or some sort of cognitive idea in people's mind that can be manipulated through messages and symbols, as opposed to counseling management on behavior that people will remember, and the reputation is essentially what people remember. So, but I'll return to my colleagues more about differences in boards.
I'm sure that Emilio will want to be more focused on the European model, but let me say one thing. I don't think there is a model of corporation today that is a point of reference. It's our culture, our Western ethnocentric culture, that leads us to believe that a company quoted on the stock exchange, driven by shareholder value, and accepting the SEC regulations is the model of, but even in this country, in the United States, there are a number of different types of corporations and different types of organizations. I heard the other day, I read an article which is fantastically interesting about these new partnership corporations.
Public-private partnerships.
Private partnerships. Then there are the B corporations that are now hundreds, and many states in this country have already recognized and helped them move. There's an enormous variety of governance issues according to the character that you are, that you want to be as an organization. In Europe, well, apart from the dual system in Germany, there are very many interesting aspects. For example, in Sweden, you are not allowed to receive money from the state, any type of money from the state, any contract or anything, unless you produce an integrated report, which goes exactly in the sort of integrated reporting in terms of multi-stakeholder, multi-channel, and continued activity of reporting an organization's activities. In Denmark, the top 500 companies of Denmark are already obliged to produce an integrated report. In South Africa, since 3 years now, this is the third year running, and they're improving in the quality of their reporting activities. They need to do, the boards that are listed on the companies that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange need to produce, now the specific thing is comply or explain. So it's not mandatory by law, but you have to, mandatory by Johannesburg Stock Exchange regulation, that you have to comply, or if you don't comply, you have to say why you don't comply. And I'm told recently that a number of companies that do not comply has decreased over these last 3 years. Now, this doesn't mean that the reports are a wonderful read. They're not a wonderful read. And I believe that a report is not a solution. The solution is reporting as a process. It has to be part of the culture of the whole organization. Even the marketing and advertising thing needs to be continuously reported. There have been some terrible incidents recently about advertising and marketing, as you well know, in this and other countries in Europe. So I think that it's a very complex scenario, and I don't think that we should focus only on the traditional Forbes 500 or whatever it is, because that does not allow us to understand what is going on in Africa, what is going on in India, what is going on in Europe, elsewhere. I don't know.
Emilio, did you have thoughts on that? And then I would also tee up the question as one of the largest, not the largest global investor. I mean, you have interaction around the world and can see some of those different experiences. What are you seeing changes in the U.S. as an investor?
Well, I'd like to first follow up on what Tony just said. I think the really precious input from his book is that even if you have intuitively understood that things are changing, and this intuition comes from the totally new world that the new media has brought. Because we come from a world of gatekeepers, where the public relation officer was the gatekeeper to the corporation, towards the stakeholders, and media, editors, journalists, and representatives of organizations were the gatekeepers of the stakeholders. Now, the empowerment of the average citizen through blogs, media, Twitter, and so forth has given a power that is sometimes abused, sometimes used, because we're in a transition process. It gives the power to the average citizen. Now, you can adapt to that, again, intuitively, but the contribution of Tony's book, and that is really important and made us all reflect, is that there can be a structural approach to that. There can be processes. What Tony just said is not just about the reports, but it's about the thought process in an organization about the need of reporting that brings even an auditor or a controller, people who are normally far away from communicative interaction with the rest of the world, to consider their own role in participating in that process of transparency and sharing that finally leads to get the license to operate for corporations. So I think that is a very important output, and that's why I'm really advising everybody to give it a look, because it helps people to set up their own structures. Now, as far as excuse me, the U.S. is concerned, well, we are an investor globally, and of course, the role that an investor plays is a role that is public, but there is also to be said, there has to be also a private role. And now in the world where, transparency tends to be a value per se, where being transparent is just good, I'm trying to advocate a little bit of thoughtfulness about that, because of course we're making our behavior in shareholders meetings and so forth transparent. So whatever we vote on, it will be public, but we don't do it immediately. We do it quarter by quarter to allow people not to be in the emotional context of the media frenzy, but to reflect about that. And there is another dimension. We obviously as investors have many one-on-ones with the corporations we interact with. Why should we publicly blame them? Why don't we give them an opportunity to start thinking about it? We're definitely not sent by God. We're just a corporation trying to make money. So who are we to publicly state what the proper behavior should be? And that's exactly what the listening exercise is about, because they may have very good reasons to act the way they act. So that is the important part where I would even advocate, and I hope I'm not being misunderstood or taken out of context, advocating also a little bit of a part where we should really think about whether transparency is necessary for everything. And I give an example from this country. There's a wonderful book about the Fed, okay? And it shows why monetary policy partly has to be decided behind closed doors.
Sure.
Because it's like if you have a big rape, okay, or a child kidnap, something that as a father or as a husband really touches my heart. And if that day you ask the population of a country in a referendum, should there be death penalty, you get another result. And in democratic processes, we need to have a proper balance between transparency and thoughtfulness.